Today I'm going to talk about testing multi-node Phoenix with Exunit. Like other people, this was kind of a longer form talk, but I've chopped this down, so we're going to go real fast. I'm Torin. This is what I look like on the internet. When I'm not programming, you find me either fishing or collecting vintage Ember.js t-shirts. I guess that's a hobby. I work at Legends, elementary and middle school, ed tech startup. We do math and science. If you're interested in video games, Elixir, check us out. So we're going to set up the problem here before we get into the testing story. When I was first getting into Elixir, I had this fun idea that ETS would replace Redis or whatever cache, and I would never need to go to the database. So on boot, I'd have my singleton gen server get all the data, shove that into ETS, and then every subsequent request, I would just interact with ETS. Really bad idea, by the way. Don't do this. But it made for a really great demo and got me into a distributed systems problem. So imagine we have this setup where we have two nodes, and someone gets into node number 1 and adds some new information. When somebody comes along and requests that new information from node number 2, and it's not there, this is our distributed systems problem. So I wanted to talk, instead of necessarily solving this problem, just how did I go about testing it? When I was first verifying it, I was actually spinning up Docker, and every time I made a change, I would actually have to do a Docker compose build, Docker compose up, manually click through. It was kind of painful. I wanted something, a tighter feedback loop, something you get in Exunit. And so this brought me closer to local cluster. And this is kind of right out of the README. It's local cluster.start nodes. Give it a number of nodes that you want to start up. And then effectively, you have two different isolated pieces of software running at the same time, but you can play with those in Exunit. Funny story, first time I ran this, it didn't work. Turns out you need to know about distribution. I knew nothing about it. This is back in like February. I was just getting into Elixir, and all I saw was this. I was like, what the heck is a match error, right? So no idea what this was, but it turns out if you come up from a cold boot and you haven't had distribution started, you need to run epmd-daemon, and then you'll have distribution. Let's jump into the test code. Now that I had distribution working, I wanted to actually spin up and hit both of these nodes. I was copying this test code really from a training I did back in February at Lone Star with Chris and Ben. And I started looking at this example they had where I was like, oh, I'm going to have different ports and probably a different host. So I need to actually get these different dynamic hosts configured. How do I do that in Phoenix? So what I found was it's pretty simple to go to the endpoint. When you init, you can actually just grab that environment variable and set the port. So let's jump back to the test. Now we have ports working. Got my con case set up. I'm doing my post. And I find some interesting behavior. As I get deeper into it, I know I've set the port, but what about the host? And so I start doing some IO inspect, and I find that in my controller, there's this manager at localhost. I have no idea what this is. So I go back to my test. I IO inspect node 1 and node 2, the two test nodes I spun up, and they were example 1 and example 2. So something was obviously broken. Long story short, I threw out the concase tests, spun up HTTP poison. I started using get and post with poison. Let's get into those tests. So I'm just doing get and post, hitting the URL directly with the port 4001 or 4002, and I hit another error. Econ refused. Turns out you need an actual server running. I'm not using the concase test helpers anymore, so I had two choices. Either go in and set a flag, all my tests suddenly are now using a real server. I didn't want to do that, because a lot of the tests don't do this. So I instead opted to just write a method that lets me flip the bit, stop and start it, so I could still test distribution just in a one-off case. Now, this isn't the whole story. I've written this whole thing up in depth on my blog and actually solved it. Source code's all available. First thing you'll find out in this blog is the whole PG2 story. So you see pub/sub end-to-end solves this bug that I showed you at the beginning. Second, I actually go even deeper into how do we test drive net splits with Schism. Schism's a library Chris Keithley wrote, lets you sort of partition the network, verify some behavior, and then heal the network. I test drive all that in this blog post. And then finally, if you want to see the full Redis implementation for the multi-node connectivity, like node A, how do they talk to node B, how do they get on the same page, that's all included, and it's at bit.ly/multinode. And if you don't like the HTTP, you can just check out my blog. I also want to give a shout out to Legends. My boss actually flew me out here and love working there. Awesome to work on video games. If you're interested in any of that, check me out.